Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Klazar podcast, where we talk about cloud GTM and GTM in general by inviting world-class leaders responsible for the shaping the modern SaaS sales and partnership strategies. Today, we have very important and such a person that I'm really excited about to bring on board. But before I introduce them, I also want to make sure that I'm inviting Brian, who's on the Klazar side. This podcast was so important for us, and it felt like there's so much content that it felt like a three-way conversation between me, Brian, and the guest would be important. So, Brian, do you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Sure. I started this podcast with Trinal. We did the first couple, and then he like took it and he was off and running. And so I'm honored to be back here with our very distinguished guest today. So Trinal, I'll let you introduce him, and then let's get to it.
Perfect. So for our guest today, we have Nelson on the podcast. Nelson is the head of worldwide partnerships at Airtable and the creator of Partner Principles, a weekly newsletter through which he shares insights and playbooks from his 17-year experience of taking partnership orgs from zero to 150 million plus in ARR. His resources, templates, and advice on partnership led revenue generation have been featured in top tier publications like Forbes, Fortune, Business Insider, and the Huffington Post. Professional milestones aside, Nelson recently celebrated a personal milestone. He's a new dad. Nelson, welcome to the podcast and tell us, before we dive deep into all the questions and everything, tell us how's the new dad life been?
Well, the first 9 months were amazing because my baby was sleeping through the night, and then there's a month and a half after that that has been significantly harder with multiple wake ups in the night. But despite that, of course, so grateful for the time with the baby and watching him grow up and just evolve. And it's been really awesome being a dad. So yeah, super excited about that. Excited to be here on the podcast as well, and really grateful for the opportunity to speak. Hopefully, it'll help people.
Well,
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. And then I'm going to hand it over to Brian. And Brian, you take it over for the first section of the podcast.
yeah. So Nelson, you're looking suave and rested. No one would ever know. But and let me kick it off by asking you. One of the things I love is how you've framed your partner frameworks of deciding who would be a good candidate to partner with. And so, could you share a little of like your lens and the criteria you use at Airtable, or you would suggest for others as they enter into partnerships, and what makes for a good partnership?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things I always recommend is when thinking about crafting a partner strategy to be really maniacally focused on the customer. And if you start there, you can architect really good, sustainable, successful partner programs over time. And so one of the things I found to be really incredibly helpful in doing that is you start off with the assessment phase with the customer. And as an example, when I joined Airtable, it's almost close to 2 years now. Back then, one of the first things that I did is I actually sat down with 10 enterprise customers. And it was really eye-opening because you get to hear firsthand from the customer on what their experience has been like with your platform, what that customer journey looks like, what are the pains that they're going through. Excuse me, I get very choked up talking about it, so it just need to clear the throat. And then how they want to get to the customer outcome. And so ultimately, that's really important to hear firsthand because it allows you to really understand the customer and how you can help them with different partner types to get to the outcome. And it also helps you understand which partner types to prioritize based on the business impact that they're telling you. So this is something I'm very passionate about, which is one of the first steps you take in the assessment phase is really go deep with your customers, and you'll learn a tremendous amount about what type of partner strategy you should roll out. And I'll just give you one very specific example that I think is a great example of like a detail and a nuance you might overlook. But when you actually interview these customers, you get to hear directly from them on the language they use. And as an example of that little detail, that can inform so many things downstream, right? Because does that language align to the way your potential ideal partner is talking to their customers or already do today? And then as you roll out partner marketing, does the customer language align there and the words that you're using, the way it's being explained, and outlined in terms of benefits to them and so forth. So it's just an example of how by going through that assessment, really paying attention to the details, deeply empathizing with the customer, it can shape and shift so many things downstream, and that's incredibly powerful. So
Yeah.
is that
And
helpful?
so you have that extremely helpful. And so you have customer centricity as like a linchpin of these partnerships. Are there other must-haves that you have or you would suggest to other partner leaders that they look for in that criteria that, hey, only partner with people if they have X and what those things might be?
Yeah. So what often happens is once you go through that ideal customer profile and you understand what that looks like and you've done the assessment and met those customers and done the qualitative side, you also want to combine the quantitative analysis on the customer side, and I'll get this to the partner side in a second. But the quantitative, it helps because you can't just do interviews. That's like one part of it. But the other side of it is looking at that data, something like cohort analysis is an example, to really understand the impacts of potential partner types and why you might partner with them. So as an example, you might look at a customer cohort with no integrations built out versus one set of customers that does have an integration built out. And you might notice a huge lift in net retention and ARR growth when that integration is actually activated, or maybe a growth in like weekly active users as an example. So the quantitative side can supplement the qualitative to provide a really holistic view when you go through that assessment phase of that customer and how you can think about partners that make the biggest impact. So leading to your question, why that's important is because you then use that to inform the ideal partner profile. And when I think about an ideal partner profile, it's really four critical things that we look at. One of them is capability. What are the capabilities of a partner in terms of, for example, the integrations they might be able to offer, or workflows they unlock, or services they provide, or their ability to drive procurement through contractual vehicles they own? That's on the capability side. And it can also be like their practice areas that they currently have with their customers today. The other aspect of it is capacity. So what is the size of their delivery bench, the size of their consultants? Is it like 10 or is it 2,000 people, right? And then the other is ultimately commitment. So, the partner might have the capacity that you need, the capability that's required to get the customer to the outcome, but you also want to make sure that they're really heavily committed to the partnership. This could be things like the executive alignment, the willingness to have cadence calls, a joint plan that you go and execute together, dedicated resources like headcount. And that's the third C. And underlying those three C's, the foundational element is the customer. And an example of that could be, do you share the same types of customers potentially by vertical or, for example, by economic buyer? And that's going to be really important because what I found is if you try to work with a partner that isn't aligned to your economic buyer, could it still work potentially, but it is usually significantly harder to get that partnership right off the ground because they're talking to different folks, working on different initiatives, and often that can be very disjointed. So that's why you also want the customer to be the foundational layer underneath those three C's.
Amazing. Thank you so much. The four C's, that's a great framework. Trinal, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. And Nelson, as you're speaking, right, I think like we spoke a lot about the mechanics, the process of getting a partnership up and running. I wanted to pick your brain a little bit on the other end of the spectrum, which is more around the strategic and the roadmap and how does the whole thing evolve. I noticed a very important yet overlooked point that you speak about through your advisory resources, and that topic is partner enablement. Could you touch upon, how partners as well as internal teams can be better equipped to align their messaging and approach to stay consistent with one another?
So I'll talk about first one of the core principles of great enablement, and then I'll dive into the framework on how I think about actually delivering it as a channel to your partners. So the first principle goes back to great enablement is ultimately anchored to being very close to the customer. So you're going to notice a theme. I'm going to mention the customer a lot, but I'll give you very specific examples of this. One of them is, as an example, co-selling with your partners. Let's say we wanted to go sell partner services to a customer. And one of the best ways to really build great enablement for that is actually to go on those co-selling motions yourself, stay super close to it. And that's important because as you actually go through that motion and the mechanics of it, you see what might be working incredibly well and where things are falling short that should be modified and iterated upon. And I'll give an example. So in many of my customer meetings, what I often found is, especially in the enterprise, they care about a couple of really key things as you go through a services motion. One is personalization, right? So as you speak to them, do you already know about the challenges and the impact that they're going through? Ideally, you have that all teed up in advance, right? And so you have that context and you're not asking discovery in that very first interaction you have as you're about to position services. The second one is they often think about, how well are these partners matched to what I need so that I can get to the outcome? And that gives them confidence to move forward. Now, an example of this would be when they want to look at engaging a partner, how many times has that partner specifically worked on that use case? And are there proof points around that, right? How often have they worked with a similar or the exact same economic buyer? Because then they're going to understand our language and the way in which we work and our, the operations of it. And another one might be how they worked with our specific vertical before, because we want that, expertise brought to the table. Those are just a few examples. But what I have found is when you get into the weeds and you actually do the mechanics and go through that motion with the customer, then that allows you to be able to build great enablement. And without those interactions and those touch points and learnings, you often don't have the true foundation to build great enablement because you haven't gone through it yourself. So that's an example of why that principle of being customer centric and being very close to it yourself allows you to help inform and build the right enablement. Now, the framework on enablement that I've often seen success with is thinking about it in generally two ways. So the digital and scale component, where you can scale it, it's much faster in terms of self-serve. And the other is the high-touch experiential learnings. And both are incredibly important, but they simply will meet people on their enablement journey where it's appropriate. And so as an example, perhaps if the partner has a lot of experiential learnings already, but just wants to touch up on it with some digital training or to have people refreshed on it, then self-serve there might make a lot of sense. Or if the partner is newer, a lot of the experiential high-touch learning is going to have a much larger impact. That could be in-person workshops that you fly out with them to. It could be co-delivery together, right? Learning on the job at hand or the engagement together. And so those are just some examples of the different ways in which you might think about enablement as channels that meet the partner on their journey. And I think the underlying principle that always needs to be reinforced is just make sure it's always anchored back to the customer and how they interact with your company and your partners. And that if you do that, you'll generally end up on a really good outcome.
That's fantastic. And a follow-up question then, Nelson, is when you talked about the co-sell process, right? And you mentioned that joining the call yourself. Like, did you end up like making a process out of it? Like, is there a team, or would you literally personally go on a lot of these calls yourself to learn about the partnership in detail?
Absolutely both. And I started it first, and that was really important because I wanted to understand the entire workflow from the beginning to the end and understand what was working and what wasn't, and to go through the motions myself. And when you cut your teeth on that process, it is so eye-opening because there's just things that you couldn't have imagined that are blind spots. I think no matter how much experience you have, that is better suited for you to go and dive in and learn on your own. And I say this having done partnerships for 17 years, and I joined many customer meetings, even on my first year on the job at Cisco when I did partnerships there. But what I found is no matter how many you go to, right, the nuance is every company is different. And it's like, no matter how similar they may seem, the reality is every company is truly unique. And it's much more important that you don't make the assumption and you actually go meet the customer and uncover what that experience is like as they work with you. And you do everything you can to optimize it and make it as seamless and incredible as possible.
And then in similar vein, like, so let's say when the partnership is starting, like you maybe have a few newer partners, few newer reps on your side. Is Nelson the goal eventually to establish that rep to rep relationship? And in that eventual goal, like if that is the goal, that's question number one. If that is the goal, how do you detach yourself at what point And what does that process look like? If you can share a little bit light, that'll be good.
And just so I understand the question, are you asking at what point does the partner rep engage with your sales rep and the channel or the partner manager might be able to remove themselves from that process?
Exactly, exactly. And what are some of the cues that you look for that, hey, this relationship is in good hands now, it's actually working. I've gotten whatever it is that I've intended to receive, and now this is in good, healthy hands. Let me focus my attention to some other rep or some other partnership or somewhere much more leverage. How do you know as a leader?
I love this question. And I love this question because it's very strategic. And the answer is nuance because it will depend on many different factors. One of them is your overall partner strategy. The second is your swim lanes that you think about. And ultimately, these are really anchored around what is best for the customer.
Hmm.
And I'll give you an example. If you are a company that has decided to go 100% reseller led, and the strategy is to give every single deal you can to resellers to create a flywheel effect, that is an executive strategic decision to go all in with resellers. And the idea would be as you give them more business, the flywheel would occur and they would start to walk you into their customers as well. And it would be reciprocated over time. And you're scaling the business by doing that sales motion and ultimately successful in driving long-term growth with your partners in a very profitable way. That's just an example. And in that case, when you've made that decision to go all in with your partners, it is incumbent on you to want to try to facilitate as much as possible so long as the quality does not degrade. So ideally, if you're able to uh, certify your partners, have them learn the co-sell motion, have them learn potentially even delivery if they do delivery in that case, and the ongoing support and so forth, and you feel that they're meeting a high quality bar based on the rigorous requirements and you put in place, then that would make sense where you'd be able to walk away if you have the right requirements and also the systems in place to go drive that at scale. And often what I found is if you don't have the right systems, you'll need a lot of that manual high touch to be able to make those motions successful. So a big part of this also is thinking about platforms and systems that allow you to remove the human element in those engagements to be able to go scale it out. But I think that's a very good example of you've made that strategic investment. And so there's very low likelihood of conflict because the only swim lane you really have is to go through partners in that example. And so then it becomes more of a question around systems and process to ensure that you can remove the human element in those workflows. And then there's going to be much more nuanced examples where you don't have as clear swim lanes. They might be dependent on a couple of variables, and that requires a lot more qualification and process that could be high touch. And especially when you're learning in the beginning, you can't automate everything because if you automate too quickly, you might be automating the wrong things. I've seen that happen before. And so in those cases, there might be this portion of time, and it may be indefinite depending on the company and the way you're going to market and the nuance that I mentioned earlier, that ultimately you might need high touch in the beginning to figure things out, right? Or maybe you just can't automate it over time. But in those cases, it would be different and you would have someone actively involved because ultimately you believe it leads to a better customer outcome. So I think the answer is that it's highly dependent. There is quite a bit of nuance to it. And I feel the more clear you are on the executive partner strategy, on the swim lanes that you're carving out for partners, the easier it is to be able to decide whether or not you can try to scale this out with automation and systems.
Yeah, I mean, like even in our case, we've seen it. Like what you said resonated really well with me is if you bring in automations much sooner, then you end up automating the thing that you shouldn't have automated in the first place. So taking the
Right.
time to understand if you are going in the right direction and then quickly jumping on to make sure it is like fully scaled and automated and all of that, it's fantastic. Now, Nelson, you've actually, scaled partnerships at, huge enterprises, VMware, and now Airtable is well on its way as well. What would you say is the key to scaling partnership function at pace with other GTM functions like marketing, sales, or any other things? Like what would you say If you had to point to one key piece, what would that be?
One key piece to scale. Oh, there's a couple that come to mind. Picking one
All
is never
right, let's
easy.
do two. Let's do
Yeah, I'll
two.
do two. I think I have to do two because I'm really passionate about one. And so the first one is very, very straightforward, which is I really believe in systems and process.
Hmm.
And I feel this firsthand, heartfelt for me, because a lot of times when you try to just throw resourcing at in terms of like people or time, it can be very, very painful to scale, and your room for error is very large. And so you really have to make sure the right technology and platforms and automation in place to reduce as much human error as possible. And that is highly critical to get to scale. And I've seen many different examples of this. And anything you can do to optimize that, if possible, gets you to scale. The second one, you know, actually, I have two other ones that come to mind, so I'm just going to mention both. One is definitely
Okay.
people. You've got to have the right
Uh-huh.
people in place that are empowered to go figure out the systems and process to be automated. That's the other thing I found, because for one person or a smaller team to try to figure that all out can be quite challenging. So you also want to make sure you have the right team in place with the right talent that can help feel empowered to bring those solutions to the table, and ultimately optimize for better customer and company outcomes. And the third one I'll mention is just something that's near and dear to my heart, which is having built mainly partner programs from 0 to 1. One thing that I have found that is so important is what I call winning hearts and minds. And what I mean by this is helping customers be successful, but either by buying the product or the services or both, and getting them to the outcome, and then sharing those customer stories with
Mm.
passion and conviction and the proof points and data. And data is important because you can say like, hey, this cohort, saw this lift, etc. That's important, of course. But to have real stories of customer transformation and success wins hearts and minds. And I'm a huge believer in that, because once you hear it directly, like as an example, a customer video about a partner doing work, and they talk about how excited they are for 30 seconds because it helped them get to this outcome, people start to get really bought in and it catches on like wildfire. They tell other people on the team, cross functionally, et cetera. And so that is one I'm super passionate about. And it's especially important in the beginning because that will help you get to scale by winning people over within your company.
That's fantastic. Very aligned with what my experience has been as well. A follow-up question, Nelson, is, let's say if you are a high-level partnership leader who's starting from 0 to 1, and you are with the organization for many years, at what point do you start thinking about different kinds of partnerships? Like, there's different kinds of partnerships like GTM partnership, tech partnership, marketing partnerships, or like ASIs, GSIs, all these different types of things. At what point in time do you start thinking about one versus the other, and how can you bring them to your organization?
It starts with the company goals. And so when you look at those, what are those, for example, top three priorities for the company as a whole? And then what you want to figure out is within your partner types, where do those partner types make an impact on those, for example, top three goals? And then you have to look at what is the business impact to the company within those, and then you have to prioritize those. And I am very much a big believer in have a strong point of view on that, informed by the qualitative
Mm.
and quantitative side as best as possible. And to be fair, it's always really hard in the beginning. And that's actually something I really enjoy, though, is like that initial challenge of the build, because you might have limited or less data, and certainly less of the qualitative as well. But you've got to do the best you can to gather all that information, and then to go have a point of view and to go make a bet. And then what you can do is you can write business memos on those prioritized partner types that you want to go make the investment in. And why I really recommend writing a business memo is really simple. And I love it because it comes from the Amazon way of doing business, which is writing about what you want to accomplish and why, and what you'll need to get there, and who's going to help you get there, is incredibly clarifying, right? It's not like a few slides where, might hit on some parts of a partnership, but you're not sure who's responsible, or you don't know what budget or resourcing is required. A memo is so thorough, you should be able to read it and say, here's why this matters to the customer. Here's the impact to the business. Here's how it's prioritized. Here's who's responsible across all the teams and what we need to get done. Here's what the timeline looks like and what change management looks like. And then here's what resourcing looks like to get to this return that we expect. And a memo does that beautifully. And then you can send that in advance to the person responsible for signing off on that, let's say, partner type launch. And you'll have crystal clarity on where it stands when you present it, right? Because then that person can ingest it, give you feedback, you end up meeting, and then you say, hey, against the other 20 company priorities, this ranks number 3, let's go do it. And you get clarity very quickly. So I'm a huge fan of memos to be able to get crisp on it and then to ultimately action on a decision once you have written it. And it allows you to weigh against the other priorities very quickly.
Nelson, as you describe the attributes and all the actions and the memos and the strategy and then the execution around the partner motion, there's so much involved in it. So my question is, for an early stage company, when is too early for them to be thinking about partnerships? Do they need to get to a certain point because they have to attribute so many resources, be able to devote X amount of resources to make it successful? Or should they be thinking about it from the inception? Or what advice would you have to like an early stage CEO and where they think about partnerships? And then when they bring on someone, an expert like yourself, to help them go from 0 to 1?
That's a great question. And basically the way I would think about it is there are these growth/maturity stages to think about as a company. And what I would say is it really depends on the partner type to determine what that might look like in terms of each of those growth or maturity stages. And I'll give an example of a few different ones. So one might be a referral partner. So for example, if you have product market fit and you're early, but your ARR may not be really high, but you have product market fit, your customers are excited about it, you're getting them to the outcome, and it's simple and it is a straightforward platform as well. You may want to simply identify partners that could refer customers to you, and it's a relatively simple motion, and the financial gain is enough for it to make sense for them to want to do so. And it's also part of the way in which they work with customers, and it's helping them help the customer get to the outcome in a better way. So that might be an example of like where it's earlier stage, where it's easier to engage partners right up front. And you'll notice I mentioned a couple of things, right? It depends on potentially the size of the company, whether or not you have product market fit, whether or not the platform is simple and easy to understand, and so forth. Now, there's some nuance to that. It's not always a perfect fit like that. It could be elements of that may fit better for certain companies. So I don't want to oversimplify, but that's an example of how I might think about it. Another one that I've seen is on the reseller and services side. And what I've often found here is it depends, but typically, usually at a higher growth stage where the ARR is more significant, and if the platform is more complex, you will typically see services partners organically arise. And the reason is because just as a function of customer demand, they need help with the complexity of the platform in order to get to the outcome. And those might include things like, discovery, design, implementation, change management, training, and ongoing support, and so forth. And so that usually happens later, and you'll see signals. So for example, in many companies I've been at in the past, organically, you start to see partners reach out and say, oh, I've been helping this customer. Or the customer will tell you and say, hey, I've been working with this third party and it's been great. Here's what they did. And you'll have these signals very quickly that you can then say, okay, there's something there. Let's go and explore a partner program to go build that out. Similarly, happens with the resale side. And often what we see is, as an example, in public sector, as you start to pick up steam there, they might say, oh, it'll ease procurement to go through a bidding process and buy through a reseller locally that we work with, as an example. And so that'll be customer driven. But really it ties back to, as you'll see and hear very often from me, is it really goes often back to the customer and where they organically drive that demand that helps signal to you whether or not you need partners and to make that investment.
Yep. And Nelson, one of the things that I think is so cool about what you do is you talk about, customer centricity, winning customer hearts, and at the same time, you're very grounded in data and systems and things like that. What advice would you have for partner leadership who you talk about, hey, they have a lot of different constituencies, even internally, that they're
Mm,
talking to sales, they're talking to marketing, they're talking to the C-suite. What advice would you have for partner leaders around the type of data that they want to make sure they're prepped with and that they have at the ready?
that's a great question. I love that question. And it's a really important one. So the way I think of it is, uh, at a high level, most partner leaders will work with sales, CS, professional services, if your company has that, marketing, product, finance, and operations. And I'm sure for some companies, there could be other departments as well. But at a high level, that's generally what I see. And then what is really critical is to, of course, know how you align to the company goals, but also as you ladder down into the cross-functional teams, understand what are the key things they likely care about with partners, and what are those KPIs as you look at those. So for sales, it could be ARR, it could be net retention, it could be win rate, ACV, average selling price, sales cycle length, right? Those are just a few examples. On the CS side, definitely net retention, gross retention, if you're like a PLG motion, active to paid users. Um, and another one could be CSAT, or like, the surveys that you're sending out and their scores against that. Another one could be attach rate. For example, if it was services, what does the attach rate look like? For the services side, it could be many of those as well that I mentioned: attach rate, the CSAT score, the NPS, the active user growth, post implementation, services revenue tied to that, and ARR growth, and so forth. So I can go through more, but I just wanted to give you a couple of quick examples. And the key is to really think about what are the things that that specific functional leader will care about with partners. And that allows you to help them understand how you're going to make an impact with their business and ultimately hit on the things that they really care about. And I'll just mention a few more as an example. Like within finance, they might be looking at payback period, customer acquisition costs, net retention as well, of course, AR growth, and of course, cohort analysis. So those are just a few examples. There's a long list of other ones with each of those, and maybe for brevity, I'll just mention those.
We'll hit the highlights. That's great. Trinal, I'm going to turn it over to you to bring us home.
Fantastic. So Nelson, we're if you've been in the space for a long time, and I have been in the whole partnership, but specifically cloud marketplaces space for a few years, and we are witnessing a drastic shift in the procurement and sales charter for modern SaaS, and an increasing proportion of deals are being routed via the cloud marketplaces. One thing we are particularly witnessing is the demand for bundled or solution ecosystem procurement from a single source. Like, you go to marketplace, you procure, everything just works. Have you witnessed the impact of this yet, either at Airtable or at any of your previous jobs, specifically in terms of conversion and conversations around building new partnerships and scaling current ones through this new route to market?
I have, and the way I've seen it has been really interesting. So at many other companies, we try to do these bundle go-to-market motions, and what I've found is varying success based on what the customer experience looks like. And the ones that were the most successful were experiences for the customer were very seamless. Like it needs to feel incredibly simple and smooth as they procure it and then use it. And where it hasn't worked is when it's more of a marketing motion, but the actual purchasing and consumption of it and deployment of it is not streamlined. And so that can often end up feeling very disjointed to the customer. So let me give a specific example. One example is when your technology is literally embedded with another technology platform, and it becomes a very smooth process in terms of the rollout, because maybe you might have a solution partner driving that whole embedded platform out, and it's all together and it's seamless. I've seen those go-to-market motions, as an example, be successful if executed well. And then on the other side, I've also run these campaigns where we try to bundle these solutions more so on the marketing side. And what we found is it can be very challenging because the customer has to have the need for multiple platforms at that same time that bundle is positioned to them. And that what we found is it doesn't often meet the customer in their journey where they are. Very rare do they often need it all right off the bat. The exception where I've seen it work better is less as like a bundled sales solution play as a go-to-market and more as a let's understand the customer needs and then we'll recommend the bundle that's the best fit. And that's where I've seen solution partners, SIs, services partners step in and do a really good job around offering that. And that tends to be very custom based on what they hear from the customer firsthand in terms of needs. So those are a few examples I can think of where we've seen pockets of success and where we haven't seen it work quite as well.
Fantastic. And Nelson, that aligns with my experience as well. Like at any point in time, like, it's very evident that you're a very customer focused leader. And I love that. I mean, we at Lazada are also very similar. Like we obsess over every single detail, every single touch point with our customers. And I've also seen a similar thing where if you obsess over those details and make sure every single touch point is optimized, beautiful things happen.
Nelson, if people wanted to find out more about you, about partnership principles, about Airtable, where should they look? Where are the best places to follow you?
Airtable is straightforward, airtable.com, one of my favorite platforms ever. And it's no code with AI, which is really exciting. And it's been really awesome because you get to see companies build these incredible apps that transform their business and get them to the outcome in a truly personalized, customized way built for the enterprise. So that's airtable.com, relatively straightforward. And then separately, one of my big passion projects is giving back to the partner leadership community. And if I can just tell a quick story on this, the reason that really drove this forward is my first mentor in partnerships was at Cisco, and he was like a big brother to me. And he taught me the ins and outs of partnerships when there was no formal training program available for it. And he would take me on shadowing calls and help me and so forth. And he actually passed away in his 30s. And that has been one of the saddest moments of my life. But one of the things that he had put on a video as a goodbye was how important it is to pay it forward. And he called it, I believe, the words were pass the torch. And this is something I think about a lot. And one of the things that has been on my mind is I've done partnerships for 17 years, and I would feel so much better if I could share my learnings as much as I could to be able to help people and save them the time and the heartache and the pain that I've had to learn experientially in building partner programs over and over again, having done it 5 times. That would mean a lot to me because I myself, to this day, I kid you not, still reference my own templates to speed up my thinking and iterations and to get better. And I'm always working on improving the templates as well. And that's something I'm just passionate about, is hopefully it just makes someone's life in partnership significantly easier and makes them more successful without all the pain and heartache that I've gone through in the last 17 years. So something I'm very passionate about. Hopefully that helps explain why I do that.
It really shines through, Nelson. I just, it's an amazing legacy for him, but also an amazing legacy for you that you're creating. So thank you so much for taking the time. We've really enjoyed it.
Thanks so much for having me.